The night was quiet, the road nearly empty, save for the occasional car whose headlights glowed against the damp pavement. The soft hum of jazz filled Olivia Carter's car as she drove, her fingers tapping gently on the steering wheel. It had been a long day, and she was ready to put behind her. Clad in a simple black sweater and jeans, she blended into the night, just another driver making her way home. Or so she thought. Flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rear-view mirror. A sigh left her lips, not in fear, but exhaustion. She had seen this scene unfold countless times before. Olivia, a lieutenant commander in the Navy, knew the drill. With calm precision, she signaled, changed lanes, and pulled over onto the shoulder, her hands resting visibly on the wheel. A white patrol car stopped behind her, the officer inside taking his time before stepping out. His boots scraped against the asphalt as he approached, moving with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. His badge caught the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. Officer Ethan Reynolds. License and registration, he barked, his voice clipped, indifferent. No greeting, no explanation, just authority wrapped in a uniform. Olivia complied, handing over the documents without a word. She had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. Was I speeding, officer? She asked, her voice even. Reynolds barely glanced at her. Tail lights out. Her brows knitted slightly. That can't be right. I had them checked last. Are you arguing with me? His tone sharpened, the warning clear. A flicker of tension passed through the air, one of those hidden truths that people like Olivia understood all too well. The unspoken expectation that she should lower her eyes, comply without question, and let him hold all the power. But Olivia Carter had never been one to cower. Still, she chose her words carefully. I'm not arguing, just stating that my car was inspected recently. If there's an issue, I'll get it fixed. Step out of the car, Reynolds interrupted, ignoring her entirely. Her fingers tightened on the wheel. May I ask why? Reynolds tilted his head, smirking. Because I said so. That was all Olivia needed to hear. The badge, the power play, the expectation that she would simply obey without question. This wasn't about a taillight. It was about control. She stepped out slowly, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. Reynolds watched her, sizing her up, turn around, hands on the car. For what reason? Are you resisting? His voice darkened as he reached for his radio. Olivia took a slow breath. She had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She refused to become another real-life story of injustice. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, she said, her voice firm. And I know exactly what you can't do. Reynolds didn't like that. His jaw tightened. You're under arrest. For what? For obstructing an officer. The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around her wrists, she knew exactly what was happening. Reynolds thought he had won. He thought she was just another woman he could intimidate. He was wrong. Because justice stories don't always end the way men like him expect. By the time the sun rose, Julia Foster, Olivia's attorney, had arrived, armed with evidence and an ironclad legal strategy. Olivia, still composed, sat across from Judge Henry Caldwell, who reviewed the case with a hardened gaze. This is an incredible story, Caldwell said, flipping through the report. Officer Reynolds, do you have an explanation for why this arrest was made? Reynolds shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable. Uncooperative behavior, he muttered. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Uncooperative? Or simply refusing to accept an unlawful order? The courtroom fell silent. Caldwell sighed. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Carter are dismissed. Furthermore, I strongly recommend an internal investigation into Officer Reynolds' conduct. Olivia allowed herself a small smile. An amazing story of justice unfolding right before her eyes. Reynolds clenched his jaw as he was escorted out. Chief Thomas Grayson, standing at the back of the courtroom, gave a single nod to Olivia. Change had begun. That night, as Olivia sat by her window with a cup of coffee, she let herself exhale. It wasn't just her battle. It was a battle for every person who had ever been silenced, intimidated, or stripped of their dignity. These justice stories needed to be told. and she had no intention of staying silent. Some stories are for sleep. Some are meant to wake people up. Olivia Carter stood on the courthouse steps, watching as Ethan Reynolds stormed out of the building, his face tight with frustration. His once confident posture had shifted into something less certain, his steps quick and tense as he disappeared down the sidewalk. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. Beside Olivia, Julia Foster let out a slow breath, her professional demeanor as composed as ever. "This isn't over," she said, tucking a folder under her arm. Olivia nodded. "I never thought it was." They had won today's battle, but change was never immediate. The real fight was in what came next. Olivia knew that. Reynolds might have been humiliated in court, but he wasn't the only one like him in the system. And if history had taught her anything, it was that men like him didn't go down quietly. As they turned to leave, a familiar figure stood waiting near the bottom of the steps. Chief Thomas Grayson. Olivia had expected this meeting. The chief had kept his distance during the trial, but now that the verdict had been handed down, he had something to say. "Miss Carter," Grayson greeted, his voice calm, measured. "Chief," she acknowledged, her expression unreadable. Grayson glanced between Olivia and Julia before speaking. "You did what you had to do." He admitted. Reynolds made his bed. Now he has to lie in it. Olivia tilted her head slightly, sensing a but coming. "But this department isn't built to change overnight." Grayson continued. "You know that. I know that. Reynolds was a problem, but he wasn't the only problem. And now that you've set this in motion, you need to be ready for what comes next." Olivia crossed her arms. "And what exactly do you think is coming next, Chief?" Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. Internal Affairs is already digging into Reynolds' past stops, and let's just say the numbers aren't working in his favor. But some officers see this as an attack on the department, not just on him. Julia scoffed. "Holding people accountable is an attack, Chief. It's called doing your job." Grayson's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Look, I'm not defending Reynolds, but there's something you need to understand. Olivia, what happened today wasn't just about one officer crossing a line. You exposed something bigger. And there are people in this department who are going to push back against that." Olivia held his gaze. "Let them," she said simply. Grayson studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then be ready." He turned and walked away, leaving Olivia and Julia standing there. The warning in his words lingered, but Olivia had already made her decision. She wasn't backing down. As she walked to her car, she checked her phone. A string of messages from fellow military colleagues, community leaders, and even some unexpected voices of support filled her inbox. The story had already begun spreading beyond Ridgefield. She tapped out a quick reply to one of the messages, then slid her phone into her pocket. This was only the beginning. The echoes of the courtroom still lingered in Olivia Carter's mind as she stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs. The moment of victory was undeniable, but she knew this wasn't over. Ethan Reynolds had been publicly exposed for his abuse of power, but consequences within the system were never guaranteed. She had seen it before. Officers who cross a line only to be quietly reassigned, their records wiped clean under bureaucratic discretion. That wouldn't happen this time. Not if she had anything to say about it. Her attorney, Julia Foster, walked beside her, flipping through a stack of legal documents. "This is bigger than just your case," Julia murmured. "The media's all over it, and with the department already under scrutiny, Chief Grayson won't be able to sweep this under the rug." Olivia nodded, but her focus was elsewhere. Across the street, the police precinct loomed, a fortress of authority where Reynolds had once carried himself with unchecked arrogance. Now, his career dangled on the edge of ruin. Chief Grayson called a department meeting. Julia continued. "He knows pressure is mounting. If he's smart, he'll make an example out of Reynolds." Olivia turned to Julia, her gaze unwavering. "I want to be there." Julia hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "I'll make the call." An hour later, Olivia found herself in the back of a packed briefing room. Officers filled the space, their postures rigid, their expressions carefully guarded. Some stole glances at her. Others avoided her gaze altogether. The unspoken tension was thick. She wasn't one of them, Not anymore. At the front of the room, Chief Thomas Grayson stood with his arms crossed. His usual air of authority was laced with something else, calculated restraint. He glanced toward Olivia before clearing his throat. We are here to address recent events that have cast this department in a less than favorable light. He began. Sergeant Ethan Reynolds has been placed on immediate suspension pending a formal investigation until further notice. He will not be wearing the badge of this department. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Some officers nodded in silent agreement. Others exchanged skeptical glances. Olivia's jaw tightened. Suspension was enough. Chief Grayson raised a hand, silencing the whispers. Let me be clear. This department will not tolerate misconduct, but we will also not let one incident define the integrity of our officers. Moving forward, we will review our training protocols and ensure accountability measures are strengthened. Olivia watched Reynolds from across the room. He stood near the exit, arms crossed, jaw clenched. The once cocky officer now looked like a man backed into a corner. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Reynolds? Chief Grayson's voice carried across the room. For a moment, Reynolds said nothing. Then, with a scoff, he pushed off the wall. I was doing my job, he muttered. I've seen officers get away with worse. But sure, let's pretend this department actually cares about justice now. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Chief Grayson's expression darkened. Consider your suspension upgraded to termination, he said coldly. Reynolds' eyes flashed with fury, but Olivia didn't flinch. Justice wasn't just about removing a bad officer. It was about changing a culture. And today, for the first time, it felt like that change had truly begun. As she stepped outside, Olivia knew there was still work to be done. But for now, she had won this battle. The next morning, Olivia Carter stood outside the courthouse, the cool morning air sharp against her skin. The previous day had been a battle, but she knew the war was far from over. Ethan Reynolds had been fired, but that didn't erase the damage he had done. How many other people had suffered at his hands? How many had been wrongfully arrested, intimidated, or silenced? Julia Foster, her attorney, stood beside her, flipping through a thick file. We have work to do, she murmured. Grayson granted access to the case records, but it's worse than we thought. Olivia took the file, skimming the reports. Page after page detailed questionable arrests, misconduct allegations, all buried under bureaucratic red tape. There were dozens of cases, and yet nothing had ever come of them. She clenched her jaw. He wasn't acting alone, Olivia said. Someone covered for him. Julia nodded. And if we dig deep enough, we'll find out who. The sound of approaching footsteps made them turn. Chief Thomas Grayson walked toward them, his expression unreadable. Good morning, Chief, Olivia greeted, her tone even. Case in sight. Not sure how good it is, he muttered. Reynolds is already making noise. His lawyer is claiming wrongful termination. Olivia exhaled sharply. Of course he is. He won't win, Grayson assured her. Not after the evidence we have. But that's not what concerns me. Olivia tilted her head. Then what does... Grayson hesitated, then pulled a folded document from his pocket. Internal Affairs started reviewing his records last night, he said, handing it to her. Turns out some of the complaints against Reynolds were erased from the system. Someone inside the department protected him. Julia took the document, scanning the names listed. You think it's someone high up? Grayson's jaw tightened. I don't think. I know. And if that's the case, this goes deeper than just one corrupt officer. Olivia looked between the two of them. Then we bring it into the light. Grayson exhaled. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. There's a formal hearing scheduled with Judge Henry Caldwell. He's agreed to review the case and decide whether to launch an external investigation into the department. Olivia's eyes narrowed. And if he does? Grayson's voice was firm. Then everyone involved will be exposed. No more cover-ups. No more silence. For the first time since this all started, Olivia felt a flicker of hope. Then let's make sure we're ready. As they walked toward the courthouse, Olivia knew this was just the beginning. Reynolds was a symptom, not the disease. If this department had a history of shielding corruption, she was going to tear that history apart, piece by piece. The courtroom was silent, As Judge Henry Caldwell reviewed the documents in front of him, the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. Olivia Carter sat beside Julia Foster, her expression unreadable, but inside, she could feel the tension tightening around her chest. This was it, the hearing that could either expose the corruption within the department or allow those responsible to continue their cover-ups. Across the room, Chief Thomas Grayson stood with his arms crossed. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the signs. This was bigger than just Ethan Reynolds. Someone had worked hard to protect him, and today they would find out who. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat and leaned forward. The evidence provided raises serious concerns about Sergeant Reynolds and his conduct. He began. His voice was steady, but Olivia caught the slight furrow in his brow. However, what concerns me even more is the apparent pattern of missing or altered records within the Ridgefield Police Department. A murmur ran through the room. Olivia exchanged a glance with Julia. This was what they needed. Judge Caldwell turned his attention to Chief Grayson. Chief, have you been able to determine who is responsible for these alterations? Grayson exhaled slowly before responding. We're still investigating, Your Honor, but the internal review suggests that someone within the department's higher ranks had direct involvement in suppressing complaints against Reynolds. The judge nodded, then directed his gaze toward Olivia. Lieutenant Carter, you were directly affected by Sergeant Reynolds' actions. Would you like to make a statement? Olivia stood, adjusting her blazer before stepping forward. She had spoken in front of commanding officers, in military courts, and in high-stakes briefings, but this moment felt different. Your Honor, she began, her voice strong. This case is about more than just one bad officer. It's about a system that allowed him to thrive. A system that ignored complaints, erased evidence, and protected those who abused their power. If we stop at Reynolds, we're only addressing the symptom, not the disease. Judge Caldwell studied her for a long moment before nodding. Noted. He turned to the prosecutor. What is your recommendation? The prosecutor, a sharp-looking man in his 50s, stood. We believe this warrants a full external investigation into the Ridgefield Police Department. This case has shown a deliberate effort to obstruct justice, and the individuals responsible must be held accountable. Across the room, Olivia saw a flicker of unease on the faces of some officers. Guilt or fear? She couldn't tell. Judge Caldwell tapped his gavel once. I agree. Effective immediately. An independent review will be conducted, and any officer found to be complicit in this misconduct will be prosecuted accordingly. A wave of relief washed over Olivia, but she knew the fight wasn't over. As she turned to leave the courtroom, her eyes met Chief Grayson's. He gave her a slight nod. They had won this round. But the real battle, the one against the entire culture of corruption, was just beginning. The courtroom had emptied, but Olivia Carter remained standing near the defendant's table, absorbing the weight of the judge's decision. The external investigation into Ridgefield's police force was a turning point, but she knew from experience that exposing corruption was just the beginning. Real change wouldn't come easily. As she stepped outside, the crisp autumn air wrapped around her. Julia Foster was already waiting, her leather briefcase tucked under one arm. You did well in there, she said, her voice even but firm. But this isn't over. Olivia nodded. Not even close. They walked down the courthouse steps together, their heels clicking against the worn stone pavement. A small group of journalists had gathered, sensing a story filled with hidden truths and justice long overdue. A young reporter stepped forward. Lieutenant Carter, do you believe the investigation will actually change the culture within the Ridgefield Police Department? Olivia met his gaze. That depends on whether those responsible are held accountable, she replied, and whether people are willing to keep fighting for justice, even after the cameras stop rolling. The journalist scribbled notes while another reporter pressed. What about Officer Ethan Reynolds? Do you think he acted alone? Before Olivia could answer, a sharp voice cut through the conversation. Lieutenant Carter. She turned. Chief Thomas Grayson stood at the edge of the steps, his expression unreadable. The crowd parted as he approached, the tension between them palpable. We need to talk, he said. Real-life stories of corruption and redemption often had moments like these, where the lines between allies and adversaries blurred. Olivia had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize one when she saw it. Privately, he added. Julia gave her a questioning look, but Olivia nodded. Go ahead, I'll meet you later, she said before following Grace into an unmarked police vehicle parked nearby. Once inside, the chief let out a breath, the weight of his years on the force visible in the set of his shoulders. I know you don't trust me, he began. Olivia didn't respond. But if you want the hidden truths behind Reynolds' protection, you need to be careful. He had connections, people who are still in power, people who are already scrambling to cover their tracks. Olivia studied him carefully. Are you saying this goes beyond the department? Grayson exhaled slowly. I'm saying this case could go much deeper than you realize. She had always known the fight for justice was bigger than just one bad cop, but now she had confirmation. A real-life story of power, corruption, and accountability was unfolding, and she was right in the middle of it. Grayson handed her a file. This was leaked to me anonymously. I don't know who sent it, but if it's real, then Reynolds was just a pawn in a much bigger game. Olivia flipped it open, her pulse steady despite the implications. More names, more officers, more hidden truths. She closed the file. Looks like we just uncovered another layer. Grayson nodded. And now, we need to decide what to do with it. The fight wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about justice stories that had been buried. It was about incredible stories of those who had suffered in silence. And it was about making sure their voices were finally heard. This was just the beginning. Olivia Carter's journey is a powerful reminder that justice is not always immediate, but is always worth fighting for. Her experience teaches us that standing up for what is right requires patience, courage, and unwavering determination. In life, we may face moments where we witness or experience injustice, whether in the workplace, in our communities, or within personal relationships. The easy path is to remain silent, but the right path is to speak up. Olivia's story proves that those who misuse power will eventually be held accountable, but only if individuals like her refuse to back down. For older adults, this lesson is particularly meaningful. With age comes wisdom, and with wisdom comes responsibility. To guide the younger generation, to share experiences, and to ensure that values like integrity and fairness are preserved. Olivia did not seek conflict, but she did not shy away from it when necessary. We all have a role to play in shaping a just world. Whether through actions, words, or the lessons we pass down, we must remind ourselves and others that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing allows injustice to thrive. But speaking up is a first step toward change.